Well, it's fun to look at the garden from the underside for a change. Thanks so much for sharing that space with us. And now we're going to be turning our attention to buzzing activity in the garden. We're going to be talking about bees, and our guest is Kellan Vincent. Kellan, welcome to Central Texas Gardener.
Thank you very much.
You're a landscape architect and a bee guy.
Yes, that's pretty much it.
And real briefly, you work in a family-owned landscape architectural firm.
Yep, landscape design and build. So we do construction.
But you, a few years ago, you got hooked on bees. How did that happen?
It was kind of a random occurrence. I started getting interested in it. I have a garden myself, and we do lots of stuff like that. And we like a lot of homesteading type stuff, my wife and I. And so I started taking classes and enjoyed it and kind of got hooked and started researching more and more, and here I am. So.
Okay, well, they're fascinating creatures,
Yes.
and we absolutely depend on them for so much. I think humans are largely unaware how much we depend on bees. Let's start by talking about what kinds of bees our gardeners here in Central Texas find in their gardens. What are the common forms?
Probably the most common bees you'll see are honeybees, and that's due to the amount of them in each hive. There's generally between 20 and 100,000 per hive.
Wow.
So if you figure a third of those are all foraging, you have a lot of bees even just in one or two hives around your yard. The less common ones would be bumblebees, which you see more in North Texas. You start to see them down here, but they don't like the heat as much. And then another variety you'll see are orchard mason bees, or the mason bee species, and they are solitary. They basically don't have much of a hive structure at all, but they come out and they're very seasonal. They'll lay eggs, they'll die off, and then they'll come back again.
And are they the ones that actually kind of bore holes in wood and things like that? You sometimes see that.
Mason bees actually use existing holes.
Oh, okay.
Carpenter bees will actually be the ones that will bore holes in non-masonry, anything that's wood or trees.
Okay.
So.
Well, the honeybees, of course, are the stars of the garden, and the ones that people love to work with for obvious reasons. These are insects that really, as I indicated, we depend on them, but they're endangered right now, aren't they, in some ways?
They're a bit under threat, and there's been a lot of reasons for that. Some of the most recent research has said that actually pesticides have been a huge influence. But what I'll say about that also is the fact that because honeybees have so much contact with humans, and we can manage them and watch them, and we know their cycles very well, they're more of an indicator species rather than the only thing becoming extinct. So if you see the bumblebees decline, or the honeybees decline, excuse me, you'll actually see probably declines of bumblebees, and they're seeing that in Europe already, and you'll actually see declines in pretty much every pollinator due for the same reasons.
Oh, okay, so it's not just the honeybees.
No,
okay.
it's just, those are the most easily tracked metric that we can come up with.
Okay.
So.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the difference in behavior, because some of these are such fascinating creatures, and we can get into more about how we can protect them in our gardens and how to lure them in and be good neighbors to them in just a moment. But there are really fascinating differences in the behaviors between these. And for example, the hive behavior of the honeybees is really complex, isn't it?
Yes. Yeah, it's a complicated system. There are basically three classes. There's a queen, which is basically a mated female that can lay eggs. And she's the only bee that can lay eggs under normal circumstances. Then you have drones, which are all the males, and they don't forage, they don't do anything but basically eat honey and then go find queens to mate with. And then you have the worker bees, which are all females. They're unmated, so they don't lay any eggs, and those are actually the workhorses of actually most of the hive. So
This sounds familiar in some way.
a little bit. It's kind of a nice life.
And we were talking just a short while ago, and they have complicated behaviors, and they manage their environment in a way that really is quite astonishing.
Yeah, part of the conversation was talking about an air conditioning that the bees actually use, and one of the things we can do during summer especially is leave water out, because they'll haul water into the hive, they'll fill up empty cells, and they'll start fanning across that liquid. They'll fan across the water. And that fanning will actually create a temperature gradient and actually cool the hive off from the inside. And you'll see them, they'll do that a lot. And another case, they'll actually pile all the bees from the inside on the external of the hive. It's called bearding, to keep the temperature down, because they keep the body heat down in the hive. So they have a lot of temperature control and stuff like that.
It's really fascinating. And also the way that they communicate with each other is complicated, but we do know that it operates on smell, right?
Yeah, it's pheromone based entirely. You'll see people with the bee beards where they have a bunch of, that's all it is. They take a female, the queen's pheromone, and they'll put it on their beard and they all attract. And the same way, that's how a queen keeps a hive. She puts off a certain smell. They'll replace her when she starts to decrease in the amount of pheromones she can give off, and they'll actually make a new queen to keep that hive intact.
Okay, and the bumblebees do have colonies, but they're not year-round colonies.
No, and that's the main difference. Honeybees collect honey to keep them going through the winter. It's all their food sources. They'll keep a hive at 92 year-round, regardless of external temperature. Bumblebees, they create, in the spring, you'll see a lone queen. She'll fly out, she'll forage, she'll find a place to nest. She'll start raising maybe 60 to 200 brood. And then at the very end of the season, she'll create queens. And those queens go out, the old hive dies, and then those queens will emerge back in the spring. So they don't need that honey stored
Like
year-round.
perennial bees.
Exactly, yeah, exactly. Pretty much.
Fascinating, fascinating. Now let's get back to coexisting with the bees. You mentioned one thing that's important to do already, which is leave water out in the summertime, have a place where they can collect it. And I've seen that at bird baths and other things. The bees line up, and I assume they were drinking.
They are, yeah.
Okay. But what are some of the other pesticides? Really are lethal.
Yes.
All forms of pesticides.
And there's different schedules you can use. I mean, if you absolutely have to use something, and and even organic is kind of a misnomer because it's still lethal to most pollinators. I use a lot of BT and stuff like that, but I use it at night, and then it'll basically degrade during the day, and it can't really harm bees in most cases.
BT, what is it?
Bacillus.
Okay.
It's a bacteria.
Okay, I know what Bacillus Thuringiensis
Yeah.
is. I thought there was a special concoction you made for bees.
No, I wish. That would be very lucrative. But no, it's all in scheduling. If you have a flowering plant, never spray a pesticide. Don't spray herbicide. Don't spray anything. It'll bioaccumulate even if it says it's not lethal. And that's what they're discovering with colony collapse is even though that the bees aren't being killed instantly, they're being very confused and disoriented, or one of the studies found 36 different pesticides in one comb.
Yeesh.
And they're feeding that to brood. So it's basically like creating a toxicity for a newborn. And that's what is causing birth defects and a lot of immune problems. And if you think about that from a bumblebee's perspective, which we're actually having a huge problem, and they're more important than honeybees in a lot of ways, if the queen goes out and forages on something with a pesticide in it, and that queen dies immediately, there is no new hive, they don't start over. And so that initial queen is very important when you're talking about a bumblebee colony, even in respect to a honeybee.
So no pesticides, really. What we're saying, if you really are going to be bee conscious.
Yes.
Now let's talk about what we can do to provide them with good nectar. What are their favorites here locally?
I've seen a lot of them. Flowering trees are your best bet.
Yeah.
And sometimes you'll walk around here and you will actually hear the trees buzzing. And the main reason is one large flowering tree is worth about 10 acres of wildflowers as far as forage goes.
Well, I have a possum hall holly right in front of my front door, and it literally, when it blooms for that short period in the spring, it buzzes.
Yep. Red buds, that's the one that they love here. I've seen them a lot on mountain laurels. Crepe myrtles, to a point, they kind of seem a little picky on that. Cherry laurels is what they're going after right now, and that's something I've seen a lot at my house. And so trees are probably the most compact, any fruit tree, any flowering fruit tree, even though it's a compact cycle, it's lots of nectar. And that's the big difference. A bumblebee goes after anything with pollen and a little bit of nectar. Honeybees will go mainly after nectar, and pollen kind of as a secondary.
Okay.
And so, some flowers that honeybees can't get, bumblebees will.
Real briefly, how can people get more involved with learning about bees?
The fastest way, there's a lot of books, a lot of websites. Bee Source is a website that has a lot of beekeepers on it. I'm part of a group at San Marcos area, Bee Wranglers, and we meet once a month, twice a month. And then there's a class every January that has a really long waiting list now, but that it's a 4-week course through the month of January to teach you how to get started, and it's everything from hive management to plants to basically the whole encompassing schedule. So
Bee herding.
bee herding, it is, and sometimes it kind of looks like it. So.
Well, it's fascinating, and we really do appreciate you coming on the program. It's been way too long since we've talked about this subject, and it's again, for humankind that depends so much on these incredibly complex little creatures, we appreciate you sharing your expertise with us. So thanks so much for coming on board.
No problem at all. Thanks for having me.
All right, and coming up next, it's our friend Daphne.